for city news and theater facts, behind the scenes, behind the acts, interviews with artists and staff will make you think and even laugh some weeks. City Speaks, City Speaks, City Speaks.
Hello, and welcome to another Zoom edition of City Speaks. I'm your host, Claire Drobot. Our stages may be dark, but that won't stop us from bringing you art via the internet. In doing just that, City recently released the audio play of Isaac Gomez's Perk Up, Perk Up, directed by Mark Masterson. The play is set in the best coffee shop in Elkhorn, Wisconsin, where the biggest challenge is pushing the cold brew until someone new arrives. A searing indictment of how deeply rooted racism is in our society, the play is a catalyst for conversation and change. Today, we're going behind the scenes to talk about the rehearsal process. I'm joined by City Theater Artistic Director Mark Masterson. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Claire.
As well as Betty Cruz and Bridget Mullins, who both served as EDI advocates and co-facilitators on the production. So welcome all to City Speaks.
Hi, everyone.
So I'm wondering, to start us off, Betty and Bridget, could you both just talk a little bit about your backgrounds and what drew you to be part of the Perk Up process?
I'll get us going, I guess. So I'm originally from Miami, Florida, first generation Cuban American, and fast forward to my life in Pittsburgh, where over the last several years I've had the chance to do work. I was in the mayor's office leading his immigrant integration work, among other initiatives, and then was spearheading a regional immigrant inclusion strategy. And most recently, I joined the team of the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh. And my personal and professional journey has always been deeply intertwined in the story of my immigrant family and my Latinx experience navigating this world as a first generation college student, first of many, and not feeling othered really until I left Miami and then got to experience other parts of America. And my partnership with City Theater actually goes back to a few other performances that we've had the chance to collaborate on. So when I learned about Perk Up, and that there was an opportunity to serve as an equity advocate, I raised my hand and saw if you guys would want to work together. I'm so proud of this production and so honored to be a part of it.
Thanks, Betty. And Bridget, your partner in crime. Can you share a little bit about your background?
Sure. I'm from a small town in Ohio, which is probably pretty similar in some ways to the town that Perk Up is set in. And I guess fast forward into some of my branching out from that small town experience. I would say that my background is in peace building and conflict transformation, as well as the arts. I was a vocal performance major, as well as a peace studies girl. And so I have always felt that I kind of have straddled both of those worlds in some way and have found the most joy and purpose when they connect and they intersect. So I spent many years working for nonprofit organizations, both in the US and internationally, organizations dedicated to seeking sustainable solutions to violent conflict and entrenched injustices. And it was really through those experiences that I discovered my love of facilitation, of thinking through ways to structure conversation and interaction in ways that transform what a group is able to accomplish together. So another part of my experience is being connected to some of the community building theater world here in Pittsburgh and other places through Pittsburgh Playback Theater and Theater of the Oppressed. And those are forms of theater that really seek, in my mind, to build empathy and encourage creative wisdom and action. So I've had the honor to work with different groups through those forms of theater, people experiencing incarceration, survivors of abuse, people experiencing occupation. So I've really appreciated and valued this powerful intersection between the arts and justice work. And then when I read Isaac's play, Perk Up, was just completely impacted by the play. It's masterful, and I think it does what art really has the power to do, which is to take something like this idea of racism, which can feel so big and just free flowing in the world, and other issues of power and oppression as well that pop up in the play. And it contextualizes them, it condenses them, it gives them dimension, and it really frames them so that they can be viewed and explored and played with. So I felt like it was a really important story for Pittsburgh, important for this moment, because racism is very much alive and well in the city and throughout our country. So it felt like a really important experience to say yes to. I'm so glad I did, even though it lasted only for a short time.
No, and I think what's so beautiful about both of your experiences is that they're sort of, concentric circles of there's an intersection of the arts and social justice, and then, personal connections to this play. And it was something as we put the production together, and we'll talk about the process in Fold Markin in a second, where it was important to Isaac and I think the team that in creating these advocate positions, there was both a facilitator of color and a white ally facilitator who were there to help build the creative team around this. And so one thing I just want to kind of start before we dive into talking a little bit about process is for audience members, is actually to go ahead and for both of you, define equity, diversity, and inclusion in your role as EDI advocates on this production. So just for audiences who might not be as familiar with that concept and how that plays into a workplace dynamic, if you can both, which is ultimately what a rehearsal room is, if you could both just maybe talk a little bit about how you define that work.
Sure. I'm like staring at Bridget like she's right in front of me, and we're like feeding off of each other. I think that for me, so diversity is who's in the room, inclusion, does that person have a seat at the table, and then equity is how much power do they actually have. So even if they have the seat at the table, there's all of these systems working against you. So it's that next level of dismantling the system and agency. So in a more simplified way, I've heard folks describe it as to being invited to the party versus being invited to dance versus being able to select the music. I think for me, what that boils down to from my own journey and experience and how it fits into this role is as I've gone from someone who doesn't come from a privileged background to someone who today, present day, has privilege. How am I using that to bring other voices into the room physically whenever possible? But if for whatever reason that's not possible, how am I shining the light on those truths and stories and struggles? Which is why I said, as we were having this conversation from the very beginning, including with Isaac, great honor to be included and be a part of the process, but I in no way represent all Latinx voices. I'm a white presenting, first generation Cuban American. So for the many different experiences I've had in my life, there's a lot of layers and a lot of relatability to other immigrant kids or family of immigrant stories and other realities. But at the end of the day, the fact that I'm a white presenting person has the role that it has because of the racist nature of our systems and society.
Yeah, and I think that's something the play tackles as well as we actually look at the character of Pedro and kind of the layers of experience that his character has. Thank you for that. Bridget, anything to kind of add of what EDI work means to you?
I think I would just add in relation to the process with Perk Up, in this specific context of I appreciate what Betty said about framing equity as kind of constantly and consistently reorganizing and redistributing power, as we notice as it pops up that there are disparities and discrepancies, and reorganizing that. So within a theater context and kind of adding EDI advocates to this process of recognizing that there are a lot of power dynamics in the world writ large and in our community, but in the space of, producing plays as well with power dynamics in theater companies, as related to actors' equity, all of these policies, procedures, processes that impact how a person could experience, like how they're able to show up, even in a rehearsal space that's striving to create a really like nurturing and brave and generative way to produce very important art together. So I think like specifically putting the words equity, diversity, and inclusion into this process, Betty and I's role, but more important than just like adding Betty and I, and really fostering like a cohort of actors and artists and community members dedicated to upholding these three values and practices, that feels like that was what it was about, of like co-creating awareness and like concrete ways that we are trying to live these things out through our work together.
Yeah, that's really beautifully said. And I think a sort of perfect transition into talking about the conception of these roles. So maybe, Mark, I'll actually start with you. But the EDI advocate positions kind of covered several different facets of bringing this play to life. So from supporting the cast and creative team, as you mentioned, to working also with the city staff and how we were a part of that process, to designing models for how audiences would engage with the play. So I'm wondering, Mark, if you can talk a little bit about the conception, and then Betty and Bridget, maybe we can start to get into the nitty-gritty details of how this was conceived.
Sure. First of all, I would start with the fact that equity, diversity, and inclusion are core values for City Theater as an organization. And that's been affirmed through our board discussions, through our staff discussions, and through our own work on who we are and why we do what we do and how we do it. So then I think the question became, how do we put those values into practice in a way, particularly in work that is directly addressing issues of race and privilege and power, in a way, what is the process that supports that? Also, obviously, Bridget was referring to a power dynamic in any creative rehearsal room, and recognizing myself that I am part of that power dynamic. I'm both the leader of the organization, or one of the leaders of the organization, and I'm also the director in the room, which most often results in people, when there's a question or an issue, all heads turn to the director to answer or to engage in solving that problem. So then how do I conduct myself in that power dynamic, recognizing my own privilege, my own power, my own place in that creative process, and the need for leadership, but for a process that is also diverse and equitable and inclusive, right? So we invited these two incredible people into our process with the goal of having transparency, having an equitable situation where all voices were recognized and encouraged to speak up, where some of the difficult issues that the play brings up for us to grapple with, which are sometimes for people like myself who are privileged, difficult to even recognize in the moment that it's happening, so we crafted together this idea of check-ins and conversations about the process itself. At the end of every day, we were quite deliberate about pausing and discussing and sharing our feelings about what was occurring in the room, as well as the subjects that the play raised.
Yeah, and I should also mention that the National New Play Network, NNPN, provided us with a grant to support this and actually to document the part of this process. So that's actually part of what this interview is doing, to share for this with theaters who might want to recreate it. So I'm wondering, Mark, you actually started to talk a little bit about what was going on in rehearsals, but Bridget, maybe you can share, this work started before production and you actually provided, material, so maybe you could talk a little bit about the work you and Betty did before we started rehearsals.
Yeah, so there was a lot of prep and thinking not only about how we would all work together as a cast and crew, but also about how to engage audiences with this powerful play. So I think with that, the word that keeps popping into my mind is empathy. And how I think that we were designing around a notion of empathy for meeting people where they're at, but also not wanting the conversations to simply linger in like the consumption of the play without additional critical thought and consideration. So I think it was like a particular kind of creative challenge in a way to think about engaging audiences, very diverse audiences or not diverse audiences might be attending the show at any given time, and wanting people to not activate that, especially white people, and sort of the white fragility response that might happen to this play of activating that like fight, flight, or freeze, like I have to guard myself against the beliefs that I feel are being challenged with this work, but how to open a space where we could get someone who might be tempted to enter that space to engage with even like a simple question, like, what does this play mean to you? Was one of the questions that we were exploring. Any sort of entry point to like welcome people into a space of further conversation and consideration of the play. So I think that's just one piece of what we were considering, and maybe a little bit vague and not in terms of specific designs that we had come up with, but I think something that was kind of at the heart of one of the sort of core challenging invitations that I felt around that sort of audience facing side.
Yeah, and also prior to the start of rehearsals, you compiled kind of a common list of reading and listening and watching for the cast and crew to look at as resources. So I'm actually wondering, Betty, if you could maybe talk a little bit about that, and also just for both of you to share kind of what was the dynamic of what's it like to co-facilitate on a production process like this.
So if I want to take it a step back and say how part of jumping into this, so the figuring out what we're going to do with the audience, how to bring them along, that was something that we were still thinking through, and we realized would be like a living process and iterating and needing to be responsive to that. But the first step was actually what does the cast and crew want and need? So really posing that question to them, and how much do folks already feel that they understand their actors? They've had to work on difficult productions before. Where is their kind of like level setting and creating buy-in and openness for a process like this, which can be perceived different ways depending on the person and whether or not they feel they want it or need it. And then from there, I think that when thinking about who would be a great team member, counterpart, ally, Bridget's experience, I've seen her take a room that's navigating a really heavy topic and find the joy in the moment, or find the pause to sit with the emotional weight of it. So I think just trusting each other and understanding different strengths and perspectives and being open and vulnerable. I remember when we were getting ready for our first meeting with everyone and the first table read, and as we were reflecting on our own life journeys, it's like, well, if you look at us side by side, maybe you think we were sisters or something, and like pointing our very different backgrounds and how it could have been us in that cafe, it could have been us in that moment. So like the difference between surface level and just, I don't know, just an open process that took us to like the depths of what people might be thinking and how to navigate this together. Because for me, I'm not from the theater world.
Mhm.
So it was also that navigating of like when to speak up and not disrupt the process, not, you know, tear actors away from their creative moment, but also inject that importance around what you're actually dealing with and struggling with and grappling with, and the message behind all of this and what it triggers up for you.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think that so smartly brings in the point that something we don't often talk about in theater, that there's actually a decent amount of potentially traumatic things that you're tackling in a play, especially a play like Perk Up, where I don't want to give away the full ending for listeners who might still not have heard the audio play, but it deals very directly with racism, and there's certainly, I think, deep emotions that are tied to that, and kind of how you help a cast mentally prepare. So this gets to a question that's for all three of you, but the idea even of addressing the fact that working on new plays as an artist is both challenging and taxing is relatively new. And even though our rehearsal process was truncated by the COVID-19 pandemic, I'm wondering if all three of you could maybe just talk a little bit about, what did you learn and gain from our rehearsal process, and then maybe what were some of the challenges as well. So Mark, I don't know if you want to start out, because I think you as an artist have worked on many productions, some of which I feel like, we carry little pieces of the ones that are challenging with us.
You're right. I mean, any play, by Shakespeare that is a tragedy deals with trauma in some way. There's plenty of plays that are rooted in trauma. So that aspect of it isn't unique or even perhaps unusual. Even comedies can be rooted in trauma. What I learned from this, and I did learn quite a bit, I feel, from the two of you actually, is the importance of reflection. Because often it's my job. I want to create an open and collaborative environment in any play that I do, but I'm not always as reflective about the impact of that process as we were in this one. And to watch the two of you in the way that you conducted our debriefing sections of our each rehearsal day, was a learning process for me, to remind myself that it's important to reflect and to let whatever is happening find a voice, so that it's not just kind of you don't just move past it, but you name it and you embrace it in a way. I think that was important. The other thing, just to say briefly, because Betty, you mentioned this word almost in passing, but I think it's an essential word, and that's trust. And any creative process, a group creative process, depends on an environment of trust. And it's both trust for all of the participants, but ultimately, in order for it to be successful, there has to be trust with the audience as well, which is more challenging because they come in a different way later in the process. But if you don't build that environment of trust among the participants early on, I think it's much harder to expect that the audience will engage in it ultimately with the kind of openness that is necessary to grapple with some of these difficult topics.
Yeah, I want to pull on a few of those strings from both Betty and Mark. Of first reiterating what Betty, you were sharing about trying not to walk in as much as possible into this process with assumptions about like where people are, what people need, what's going to work, I think that the people involved in this production really cared a lot about it, and cared because it's a work to catalyze anti-racism, and it was people that care about that. And so along with that, there can be some like anxiety, fear, trepidation about like wanting to do it well. And And so the trust that you're talking about, Mark, and we talked a lot about in the space of creating a brave space, recognizing that our conversations would sometimes feel inadequate or incomplete, or that there might be moments of just hard emotions, tension, complicated feelings, and that was part of it. And so what I really appreciated about working with Betty, especially in our shared roles and the strong sense of tag teaming that I felt, which was so nourishing and amazing, but that broader sense within the team as well, is that like EDI and white allyship and anti-racism is not some like checklist or toolbox with like the right things that you can say or the right things that you can do in any given process. It's about like giving our best intention to trying something that we think might serve the process and serve what we want to accomplish, and then letting it evolve and change or throwing it out the window to try something else. That sort of dynamic sense of what we were up to with the grounding values and caring for each other and bringing this piece to life was something that is definitely going to stick with me as I move forward from this work.
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, it's a few different things, and it comes back in large part to the people. So I so appreciate, and Bridget and I often talked about how you, Claire and Mark, made space for this because of this process, but how you were continuously in the process intentional about making space for us, and how you guided that and yeah, allowed for it to go wherever it went. So that, again, coming back to that word of trust. And then I think of Isaac, and he's like the epitome of like radical empathy, and the way he's so disarming in the most heaviest of topics, and different, interesting reflections. And he just has a real way about him where I felt I was always hanging on his every word. And I think that coming back to Bridget's point and how we started with this grounding, brave space poem, and getting us out of, what's safe, but truly what's brave, and how many times for us, even, we're here as advocates, and yet it's hard. These are difficult conversations. It's hard. It's uncomfortable. It's awkward. And I just found myself continuously like having to go through that emotional process of, this is really hard. Should I say something now? And I'm also new to the acting world. And but again, the appetite that we fed off of, that folks wanted, the depth of it, and that we were in it together. And I think it's all like, it's not one moment in this process that is like the magic component to it. It's the whole thing. I think it's how we grounded it from the very beginning, and how we kept that continuous reflection and check-in throughout. And with each time that we sat down at the table together, the actors more and more, encouraging and wanting to reflect and to go deeper. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that so beautifully encapsulates both some of the challenges and takeaways for all of this in this process. And you both mentioned, Isaac's vision for this piece and the creation of this play as a catalyst for anti-racism work. And Betty, I'm going to throw this to you, but obviously Mark or Bridget, feel free to chime in. But I think especially since, as you mentioned, you're maybe the furthest removed from the theater world. So I'm just wondering, what are the connections to the social justice sphere for a play like Perk Up? And what is the role of theater and art, in a broader sense, in anti-racism work?
I think art is central to how we live our lives. So, just talking about how we're navigating the world today, in the midst of a pandemic, and feeling the vacuum, the void that's left. and the need, the vacuum and void by the disrupted ability to connect as deeply as we would like, and the important role that art plays in subtle, sometimes unconscious, sometimes very obvious ways. So I'm not an artist, but I'm a believer that art is essential to community building, and it is a key way to maybe talk about the uncomfortable things that other folks don't want to recognize or own, and put it on a stage where others who would never digest it or even see themselves in a certain light can maybe have that mirror held up to them. So in terms of the role in social justice, I think it's paramount. And we see that again loud and clear today when you have folks just taking to their balconies and singing, or having dance parties like they're doing in Miami from balconies apart. But you feel the hunger and the craving for that. And at the same time, in this collective moment that we're having of pain, of fear, of uncertainty, and of knowing that something very, very new and very different is going to come out of it, we're also seeing, racism is still alive and well. There's still people that are being blamed for this moment. There's still humans that are being dehumanized because of it. So I think not only has art always been essential, it's going to be so essential in moving us through this, and into a more empathetic world.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully put. Mark or Bridget, anything to add maybe about kind of how you see the role of art in this current moment, in a moment of isolation, and fear, I think, for a lot of people.
I think a lot of what art can do is to ask the right questions.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure we're great at proposing solutions always. When we do, we become prescriptive or ideological in a way that might actually shut off the possibility for people to engage in trying to solve a problem. So I think that asking questions is just in the nature of what we do, and there are plenty of questions that need to be asked right now, is what I feel. So I do believe in community. It's one of the things I love about Pittsburgh, and it's also one of Pittsburgh's great weaknesses, frankly, because there is a very strong sense of community, but that also can mean exclusion and barriers for people to move between the communities that exist in Pittsburgh, for example. And our ability to connect live and in person is one way for us to break some of those barriers down. A gathering place where people from different walks of life are welcome and where those exchanges can occur is the idealistic goal. Mm-hmm. Whether we always reach that goal, I think, is also subject to question, but the pursuit of that goal is in and of itself important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, then, I just one thing I think before we wrap up, I feel like this could be a 3-hour-long conversation. But I'm wondering, in the idea, this is something I think about a lot, that art is often a useful tool for building community, but there's a desire of both, especially I think in this current moment, that just exacerbates inequity and racism and how it affects different individuals in our communities. But just in the broader sense of that, you have something like a play like Perk Up that can start a conversation. But what are some ways for listeners to get involved in the community, both in this current moment and I think in a broader way? Are there resources or places to look if you're moved by this piece to take action?
I can jump into a few, and then I'd love for other people to tag team stuff as well. I think that one place to start is use this time to continue developing your own critical consciousness. Mm-hmm. by reading things, particularly by people of color, books, podcasts, documentaries, movies, you name it. Talking to other white people, this for white people, talking to other white people about whiteness and privilege and what that looks like in your life, what that looks like in this moment. And I think like showing up in spaces that are still available to you, like cross-racial spaces, that is still possible in this moment in our virtual space, conversations, meetups, discussions, forums that are being hosted throughout the city related to how this pandemic is particularly affecting communities of color. So I think that there's many ways for patrons or whoever who are listening to this play and are interested in taking further action to do both in the individual sense of continued learning, but and in the relational sense as well.
Yeah, I think I would add to that. I think those are really important points. I guess I would just say there's some good tips at Perk Up if you pay attention. So I will just, without saying too much, the power of listening. And making sure that there are voices of underrepresented people in the room and giving them the right to speak. They have that right. So knowing when to listen, which is more often than you would think. And I think in addition to that, and those are things that you can do wherever you are, whatever space you're in, whatever virtual meeting you might be a part of, or once we're in physical shared spaces again, whether you're at your place of worship or at your job, paying attention to who's in the room and how much, and making sure they have the stage just as much, if not more than you do. But I also think in this moment, what are the everyday ways you can support folks? So that's, supporting small businesses, nonprofits who are run by people of color, particularly Black Americans, folks that are working on the front lines with communities that are facing the most dramatic injustices. So organizations like Casa San Jose, who work with our undocumented, predominantly Latinx community, is one.
Yeah, and I should say for listeners, we've compiled a list of resources, both ways to educate yourself, but also ways to get involved with community partners, and we'll be sharing that in a post-audio play email that'll go out toward the end of the audio play run. And we're also excited to invite listeners to engage with us in a community conversation that we're planning, a way to introduce some of our community partners and the frontline work that they're doing in Pittsburgh. So I just want to, first of all, thank all of you for being a part of this conversation. It was just a real joy and privilege, and I feel like I personally learned so much as part of this process. So thank you for your work on the production and for joining us today. For listeners, the audio play of Perk Up is available for streaming from now until April 21st. All single tickets are pay what you want and start at just $10. You can visit City Theater's website, www.citytheatercompany.org, to purchase and learn more about the production. Our theme song for CitySpeaks is composed by Matt Schatz, and we hope you will join us next week for more behind-the-scenes stories on CitySpeaks.